You don't get to talk to her like that." The words left Ava Brooks' mouth before she could stop them, sharp and steady, cutting clean through the low hum of clinking glasses and quiet conversations inside Whitmore House, one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown Chicago, where a single steak cost more than her weekly groceries, and where people like her were expected to move quietly, smile politely, and never, ever make a scene. But tonight something snapped, because she had seen that look before, the dismissive glance, the subtle shift in tone, the way the waitress, a young black woman barely in her 20s, stood there clutching her notepad like it was the only thing keeping her steady while the man in front of her spoke in that controlled, irritated voice that didn't need to be loud to feel humiliating. And Ava felt her chest tighten the same way it used to when customers would talk over her at the diner, or when managers would assume she made a mistake before even checking the receipt, or when someone would say, "Relax," in that tone that really meant, "Know your place." And suddenly she was already stepping forward, heels clicking against polished marble floors, heart pounding louder than the jazz music floating through the room. "She said the kitchen is backed up. That's not her fault," Ava added, her voice rising just enough to pull attention from nearby tables, a few heads turning, forks pausing midair, because scenes didn't happen here, not in a place where everything was curated, controlled, perfect. But Ava wasn't thinking about that anymore. She was thinking about every time she stayed quiet and wished she hadn't, every moment she swallowed her words just to keep a paycheck, and she was done with that. "You don't get to treat people like they're disposable just because you're paying for dinner," she said, locking eyes with the man now, really seeing him for the first time, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her rent, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that only made her more certain she was right. Because men like that always thought they were right, always thought they were above consequences. "If you've got a problem, you can talk to the manager, but don't take it out on her," Ava finished, her breath slightly uneven now, the adrenaline catching up with her as silence settled over the room like a sudden drop in temperature, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small movement, every glance, every judgment. And for a split second she wondered if she had gone too far. If this was the moment, everything would come crashing down the way it always did when she pushed back. But then something unexpected happened. The man didn't interrupt her, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look annoyed. He just studied her, eyes steady, almost curious, like he was trying to understand something he hadn't seen before. And that threw her off more than anger ever could. "Is everything all right here?" Another voice cut in suddenly, a restaurant manager rushing over, his tone tight, nervous, eyes flicking between Ava and the man she had just confronted. And then, in a shift so subtle but so powerful it changed the entire atmosphere of the room, his posture straightened, his voice softened. "Sir, your table is ready, Mr. Whitmore." And just like that, the name landed, heavy, unmistakable, rippling through the air in a way Ava could physically feel, like a cold wave washing over her skin. Whitmore, she knew that name. Everyone did. It was on buildings, on headlines, on the skyline itself. And suddenly the pieces clicked together too fast for her to stop them. The suit, the calm, the way the staff reacted, and her stomach dropped as realization hit. She hadn't just yelled at some entitled customer. She had just called out Ethan Whitmore, the millionaire CEO whose company owned half the city, whose decisions moved markets, whose name carried weight in rooms she had never even stepped into. And for a moment, everything inside her went still, the confidence draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon, replaced by a sharp, sinking awareness of exactly where she stood, not just in the room, but in the world, and how easy it would be for someone like him to make sure she never worked in a place like this again, never got another recommendation, never got another chance. But still, even with that fear creeping in, something stubborn in her refused to let her back down completely, because she had meant what she said, every word of it. And if she had to face consequences, at least it would be for telling the truth. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, as the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath waiting for his reaction, Ethan Whitmore did something no one expected. He smiled, not wide, not mocking, just a small, controlled curve of his lips that carried more intrigue than offense. And before Ava could even process that, before she could figure out what it meant, a soft movement from across the room drew attention again. An older woman rising slowly from her seat, elegant in a way that didn't need to announce itself, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture regal, her presence commanding in a quieter, deeper way than anything else in the room, and her eyes, sharp and assessing, were locked directly on Ava, not with disapproval, not with judgment, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, as if she had just witnessed something rare, something valuable, something she hadn't seen in a very long time. And as that woman, Margaret Whitmore, took a single step forward, her gaze never leaving Ava, the entire balance of the moment shifted again, because whatever was about to happen next, Ava could feel it in her bones. This was no longer just a mistake. It was the beginning of something she had no control over. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked, slowly, like glass under pressure, beginning with the faint scrape of a chair somewhere in the back of the room, and the low murmur of someone whispering a name that carried weight far beyond those walls. Whitmore, and Ava felt it again, that shift in the air, the invisible line between people like her and people like him becoming painfully clear, her pulse still racing but now tangled with something colder, something sharper, the realization that she had not just crossed a line. She had stepped directly into a world where every mistake came with consequences she could not afford. Yet even as doubt crept in, she kept her shoulders squared, refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for defending someone who had needed it, because that part of her, the part that refused to be silent, was the only thing she truly owned, and she was not about to give it up now, not even here, not even in front of him. And then Ethan moved, just a slight shift of his posture, but enough to draw every eye again, his gaze never leaving Ava's face as if the entire room had faded into background noise. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, carrying easily without needing to rise. And the question caught her off guard because it was not what she expected, not anger, not dismissal, just curiosity, genuine and unsettling. "Ava," she replied after a beat, her voice steadier than she felt. And for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something neither of them fully understood yet, until the manager stepped in again, clearly desperate to regain control. "Miss, I am going to have to ask you to lower your voice or leave," he said, his tone polite but firm, the kind of politeness that was really a warning. And Ava felt the familiar sting of being singled out, of being the problem even when she was not the one who started it. Her jaw tightening as she glanced at the waitress who had gone completely still, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak or disappear. And that was enough. That was always enough. Or what? Ava said quietly, not loud this time, but firm, grounded, the kind of tone that did not need volume to carry weight. And the manager hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough for Ethan to step in. "That will not be necessary," he said, his voice cutting clean through the tension without force. And immediately the manager backed off, nodding quickly, the power dynamic shifting again in a way that made Ava's stomach twist, because this was his world, his rules, his word alone enough to change outcomes. And she hated that part of it, hated how easily everything bent around him. And yet, at the same time, she could not ignore what he had just done. He had not silenced her, had not dismissed her. He had protected her from being thrown out, and that contradiction unsettled her more than anything else. "You were not wrong," Ethan added, almost casually, but the words landed heavy, pulling her attention back to him instantly, because she had expected pushback, expected to be told she misunderstood, that she overreacted, that she should have stayed in her place. But instead he was agreeing with her, and that did not fit the story she had already built in her mind about who he was. And for a second she did not know what to do with that. "Excuse me," she said, brows furrowing slightly, and he gave a small nod toward the waitress, who was still standing there, frozen between fear and confusion. "She deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of where she works," he said, his tone even. But there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something that suggested he was not just saying it for show. And Ava blinked, the tension inside her shifting. Not gone, but changing shape, because this was not how this was supposed to go, not how men like him usually responded. And before she could say anything else, that same elegant older woman began walking toward them, her presence commanding attention without effort, conversations around the room lowering instinctively as she approached, her heels making soft, deliberate sounds against the floor, each step measured, intentional. And Ava felt it again, that instinctive awareness that this woman was someone important, someone who did not need to announce it because everyone already knew. And when she finally stopped beside Ethan, she did not look at him first. She looked at Ava, her gaze steady, assessing, but not cold, never cold. That was quite a statement, the woman said, her voice smooth, controlled, carrying a quiet authority that felt even stronger than Ethan's, and Ava straightened slightly, unsure whether she was being criticized or acknowledged. Someone had to say it, she replied, unable to stop herself, because backing down now would feel like betraying everything that led her to speak in the first place. And for a moment the woman simply studied her, eyes narrowing ever so slightly as if searching for something beneath the surface, something deeper than just the words she had spoken. And then, unexpectedly, she smiled, not the polite smile people used in rooms like this, but something warmer, something real. Most people here would not have, she said, her tone thoughtful. And Ava felt a flicker of confusion, because approval was the last thing she expected from someone like her. Mother, Ethan said quietly, a subtle warning in his voice. But the woman did not look at him. Not yet, her attention still fixed on Ava as if the rest of the room no longer mattered. What you did required courage, she continued, and the word landed differently than anything else that had been said so far, because no one had ever used that word for something like this. Not for speaking up in a restaurant, not for refusing to stay silent. And Ava felt something shift inside her again, something she could not quite name, something unfamiliar but undeniably powerful. And then the woman finally turned slightly toward Ethan, just enough to acknowledge him without breaking that connection entirely. You should pay attention, she said, her voice soft but firm. And there was meaning there, something layered, something that went beyond the moment itself. And as Ava stood there, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to possibility, she realized this was no longer just about a mistake in a restaurant. This was something else entirely, something bigger, something that was already beginning to pull her into a world she had never planned to enter. And for the first time since she walked in, she was no longer sure she wanted to walk away. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for Ava to feel every pair of eyes still on her. Long enough for the weight of where she was to press back in. And just as quickly as it had shifted, the room began to move again. Conversations restarting in careful whispers, silverware clinking against plates as if nothing had happened. Because in places like this, discomfort was never allowed to linger, it was smoothed over, hidden beneath polished manners and quiet denial. But Ava could not unfeel what had just happened, and she could not ignore the way Margaret Whitmore was still looking at her. Not as if she had caused a scene, but as if she had revealed something, and that unsettled her more than judgment ever could. I should go, Ava said finally, the words coming out softer than before, not because she was backing down, but because she suddenly felt exposed, like she had said more than she intended, like she had stepped too far into a space that was never meant for her. And for the first time that night, she became aware of her own reflection in the glass behind the bar. The simple black dress she had borrowed from a coworker, the shoes that were clean but worn at the edges, the subtle differences that marked her as someone who did not belong in a room where everything was curated for perfection, and she hated that she noticed it, hated that it still mattered, even after everything she had said. You do not have to leave, Ethan said, his voice steady, not commanding, not pleading, just stating a fact as if her presence there was not something that needed justification. And Ava hesitated, because part of her wanted to accept that, wanted to stay just to prove that she could, that she deserved to exist in any space she chose. But another part of her, the part that had learned survival through caution, knew better than to get comfortable in a world that could turn on her just as quickly as it had opened. I think I do, she replied, meeting his gaze one last time. And there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not anger, not defiance, but clarity, the kind that came from knowing exactly how fragile moments like this could be. And without waiting for permission, she turned, her steps measured as she moved toward the exit, each one grounding her, pulling her back into a version of herself that made sense, that she understood. But she did not get far before a voice stopped her, not loud, not urgent, but firm in a way that made ignoring it impossible. "Ava," Margaret called, and Ava paused, just for a second, her hand hovering near the door handle as she turned slightly, enough to acknowledge without fully re-engaging. And Margaret approached again, slower this time, her expression thoughtful, almost reflective, as if she was piecing something together in real time. "You said something important tonight," Margaret said, her tone quieter now, more personal, as though the conversation had shifted away from the public moment into something more intimate. And Ava gave a small, uncertain shrug. "I just said what I saw," she replied, because that was the truth. She had not planned anything, had not calculated the risk. She had simply reacted, and Margaret nodded, a subtle motion that carried more weight than it should have. "That is exactly why it matters," she said. And there it was again, that unsettling sense that this woman saw more than she was saying, that she understood something about Ava that Ava herself had not fully put into words. And before Ava could respond, Margaret reached into her bag, pulling out a small, elegant card, holding it out with a calm confidence that suggested she already knew Ava would take it. "If you are ever interested in a conversation that does not happen in a room like this, I would like to speak with you again," she said. And Ava stared at the card for a moment, her mind racing, because nothing about this made sense. People like Margaret Whitmore did not just invite strangers into their world, not without a reason, not without something to gain, and every instinct Ava had told her to be careful, to question it, to walk away before she got pulled into something she could not control. But there was something else too, something quieter but just as persistent, curiosity, the kind that made her wonder what could possibly come from a conversation that started like this. And slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and took the card, the smooth texture cool against her fingertips, a physical reminder that this moment was real, that whatever this was, it was not just in her head. "I will think about it," Ava said, her voice neutral, giving nothing away. And Margaret smiled again, softer this time, as if that answer was exactly what she expected. "That is all I ask," she replied, stepping back just enough to give Ava space, but not enough to break the connection entirely. And for a brief moment, Ava's eyes flicked toward Ethan, who had remained where he was, watching the exchange with that same quiet intensity, not interrupting, not inserting himself, just observing. And something about that, about the way he allowed the moment to belong to her and his mother without taking control of it, lingered with her longer than she expected. And then, before she could overthink it, before she could talk herself out of it, Ava turned and walked out into the cool Chicago night, the city air hitting her face like a reset, the sounds of traffic and distant sirens grounding her in something familiar, something real. And she exhaled slowly, her grip tightening slightly around the card in her hand as she stepped onto the sidewalk, because she knew one thing for certain: whatever had just started back there was not over. It was only beginning, and whether she liked it or not, her life had already begun to shift in ways she could not yet see. The city felt different once the doors closed behind her, not quieter, not calmer, just more honest, the kind of noise you could understand: car horns in the distance, footsteps on concrete, the faint rumble of the train tracks a few blocks away, all of it grounding in a way that the polished silence inside Whitmore House had not been. And Ava walked without rushing, her heels tapping a steady rhythm against the sidewalk as she tried to make sense of what had just happened, replaying every word, every look, every shift in tone, especially the way Margaret had looked at her, not like a stranger, not like someone out of place, but like someone who belonged in a way Ava had never been invited to believe before. And that was the part that unsettled her the most, because anger she understood, judgment she expected, but recognition, that was dangerous. That was the kind of thing that made you question your own boundaries. And Ava had spent too long building those to let them fall easily, her fingers tightening slightly around the card still in her hand as she reached the bus stop, the overhead light flickering just enough to remind her she was back in her world now, where things were not curated or controlled, where everything showed its wear. And she exhaled slowly, pulling her jacket tighter as the night air cut through the thin fabric, the chill grounding her further, bringing her back to the reality she knew, the one where rent was due in 4 days, where her morning shift started at 6, where standing up for someone did not come with invitations from powerful families. It came with consequences. And yet, Despite everything she told herself, she did not throw the card away, did not crumple it or tuck it out of sight. Instead, she kept it in her hand, turning it over once, reading the embossed name again. Margaret Whitmore, the letters clean and deliberate. A name that carried weight in a world she had never been part of, and she hated that it meant something to her now. Hated that it made her hesitate, made her wonder what would happen if she called, if she stepped into whatever that invitation represented, and before she could follow that thought too far, the bus pulled up with a long hiss, doors folding open as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of worn seats and late-night commuters wrapping around her like something known, something safe, and she moved toward the back, dropping into a seat near the window, her reflection faint in the glass as the city lights blurred past. And for a moment, she just sat there, letting the motion carry her, letting the rhythm of the ride steady her thoughts, until her phone buzzed in her bag, pulling her attention back, and she reached for it, already expecting a reminder or a message from her manager, but instead it was a text from her coworker Jasmine, asking if everything went okay tonight, and Ava stared at the screen for a second before typing back a simple response. Yeah, it was fine, because explaining what had actually happened felt impossible, like trying to describe a shift in gravity to someone who had never left the ground, and she slipped the phone back into her bag, leaning her head lightly against the window as the bus moved through neighborhoods that felt more like home, small storefronts, dim streetlights, people walking with purpose, and slowly, the tension in her shoulders began to ease, her breathing steadying, her mind returning to practical things, to what needed to be done tomorrow, to how she would make it through another week, because that was what she knew, what she trusted, routine, effort, persistence, not unexpected encounters with people like the Whitmores, not invitations that came without explanation, and yet, even as she tried to settle back into that mindset, something lingered, a quiet pull she could not ignore, the memory of Ethan's expression when she spoke, not defensive, not dismissive, but attentive, as if her words had actually mattered, and that was new, that was unfamiliar in a way that made it hard to dismiss, because it challenged something she had come to accept, that speaking up only made things harder, that it rarely changed anything, but tonight it had, even if she did not yet understand how. And as the bus slowed to her stop, she stood, moving toward the exit with that same steady rhythm, stepping back onto the sidewalk of her neighborhood where the streetlights buzzed softly overhead and the buildings showed their age without apology, and she walked the last block to her apartment, the worn steps creaking under her weight as she climbed, unlocking the door to a space that was small but hers, the familiar layout, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the stack of bills on the counter, all of it exactly where she left it, unchanged, untouched by whatever had happened downtown. And for a moment she just stood there, letting that contrast settle in, two worlds that existed side by side but rarely touched, except tonight they had, and now she was the one standing in between, holding a card that could pull her further in if she let it, and slowly, almost without thinking, she placed it on the small table near her bed, not hidden, not discarded, just there, visible, present, a choice waiting to be made. And as she sat down, kicking off her shoes, rubbing her hands together to warm them, she told herself she would not call, that she would not get involved, that whatever that moment was, it ended when she walked out that door. But even as the thought formed, it did not settle the way it should have, because somewhere beneath the caution, beneath the instinct to protect herself, there was something else growing, something quieter but stronger, the feeling that this was not over, that the world she had brushed against for a single night was already beginning to reach back, and whether she wanted it to or not, it was not going to let her go so easily. Morning did not wait for her to figure anything out. It never did. It arrived the same way it always did, with the dull buzz of her alarm at 5:30, the faint gray light creeping through the thin curtains, and the weight of responsibility settling in before her feet even touched the floor, and Ava sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, her body still carrying the tension from the night before, but her routine pulling her forward anyway, because there was no space in her life for lingering too long in uncertainty, not when rent was due, not when shifts depended on showing up on time, not when stability was something she had to fight for every single day. And she moved through her small apartment with practiced efficiency, brushing her teeth, tying her hair back, slipping into her uniform, the fabric slightly worn but clean, presentable, enough to get through another day, and as she reached for her bag, her eyes flicked briefly to the small table near her bed, where the card still sat exactly where she left it, untouched but impossible to ignore, and she paused for half a second, just long enough to feel that quiet pull again, that curiosity pressing at the edges of her thoughts, but then she turned away, grabbing her jacket, because she did not have time for what-ifs, not today, not when reality was waiting outside her door, and the morning air hit her with a sharp chill as she stepped onto the street, the sky still heavy with early light, the city not fully awake yet but already moving, and she walked quickly toward the bus stop, falling into step with the rhythm she knew, the one that kept her grounded, kept her focused, and by the time she reached the diner, the familiar bell above the door chiming as she stepped inside, she had almost convinced herself that last night was just a moment, something unusual but contained, something that would not follow her into the rest of her life. "You are late by 2 minutes," her manager called from behind the counter. Not looking up, his tone clipped, routine, and Ava nodded, already tying her apron. "It will not happen again," she replied, because that was the language of this place, direct, efficient, no room for explanation, and she moved into her shift without hesitation, pouring coffee, taking orders, balancing plates, her hands moving on instinct as the morning crowd filtered in, construction workers, office employees, people who needed something quick before their day began. And for a while, everything felt normal again, predictable, safe in its own way, until it wasn't, because as she wiped down a table near the window, her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she almost ignored it, almost let it wait until her break. But something told her not to, something small but persistent, and she slipped it out, glancing down quickly, expecting another message from Jasmine or a reminder, but instead her breath caught, just slightly, because the number was unfamiliar and the message was simple, direct. "Good morning, Ava. This is Ethan Whitmore. I hope I am not interrupting your day. I would like to speak with you when you have a moment." And for a second the noise of the diner faded, the clatter of dishes, the low conversations, all of it pulling back as her focus narrowed to the screen in her hand, because this was real. This was not just a lingering thought or a possibility. This was him reaching out, stepping into her world in a way she had not expected, and her first instinct was to put the phone away, to ignore it, to pretend she never saw it, because that would be easier, safer, more in line with the boundaries she had built for herself. But her fingers did not move, her eyes still fixed on the message as her mind raced, weighing options she did not feel prepared to choose between. "Ava, table 4 needs their check," her manager called again, sharper this time, and she blinked, snapping back into the present, slipping the phone back into her pocket as she grabbed the checkbook, moving toward the table with a steady expression, because whatever this was, it could wait. It had to wait, at least until she finished her shift, until she could think clearly, until she could decide whether answering that message meant stepping into something she could not control, or turning away from something she might never be offered again. And as she set the check down, offering a polite smile, her mind was already elsewhere, caught between two worlds that were beginning to collide, and for the first time since she woke up, she realized that ignoring it would not make it go away, because he had already crossed the line between them. And now the question was not whether this would continue, it was whether she was willing to meet him halfway. She did not check her phone again for the next 2 hours, not because she forgot, but because she could not afford to think about it while balancing 3 tables, refilling coffee, and keeping up with orders that came faster than she could write them down. Yet the message sat in the back of her mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade, shaping every small pause, every breath between tasks, until finally her break came. 15 minutes carved out of a constant rush, and she stepped outside the diner, the door swinging shut behind her as the noise dulled into something distant. The midday air crisp but brighter now, the sun high enough to cast clear shadows across the sidewalk, and she leaned lightly against the brick wall, pulling her phone from her pocket with a hesitation she did not bother to hide from herself, because this was the moment she had been avoiding, the point where ignoring it was no longer an option. And for a second she just looked at the screen, her reflection faint in the dark glass, her expression thoughtful, guarded, as if she was trying to read her own reaction before responding to his. And then she opened the message again, reading it more carefully this time, noticing the tone, the lack of demand, the space he left for her to choose, and that mattered more than she expected, because it did not feel like pressure. It felt like an invitation, and invitations were harder to reject when they came without force. Her thumb hovering over the keyboard as her mind ran through every possible outcome, every version of what this could become, and she told herself to keep it simple, to stay in control of the situation, to respond without giving anything away. I am at work. Right now. She typed slowly, each word deliberate, measured. I have a break in 15 minutes. That is all the time I have, and she read it once before sending, making sure it said exactly what she meant. Nothing more, nothing less. And as soon as the message went through, her heart picked up just slightly, not from excitement, but from awareness, because she had just stepped into something she could not undo. And the reply came faster than she expected, almost immediate, as if he had been waiting. That is enough. I will meet you where you are. And Ava frowned slightly, her eyes lifting from the screen to the street in front of her, because that was not what she anticipated, not a request for her to come to him, not a suggestion of somewhere neutral, but a decision to step into her space. And that shifted something, not entirely comfortable, not entirely unwelcome, just different. And before she could question it further, a sleek black car slowed near the curb, smooth and quiet, drawing attention. Without needing to announce itself, and Ava straightened slightly, her instincts sharpening, because moments like this did not happen in her world without meaning something. And the car came to a stop, the driver stepping out first, opening the rear door with practiced precision. And then Ethan stepped out, exactly as composed as she remembered, dressed in a tailored navy suit this time. His presence fitting the car, the street, the moment in a way that made the contrast between them impossible to ignore. And yet he did not look out of place here. He simply looked like someone who chose to be wherever he stood, and that was a different kind of power, one Ava noticed immediately. And for a second neither of them spoke, the city noise filling the space between them, cars passing, footsteps nearby, life continuing as usual, while something entirely separate unfolded on this small stretch of sidewalk. You came here, Ava said finally, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. Because she needed to understand why, needed to see how far he was willing to step outside his world, and Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze steady. You said you had 15 minutes, he replied, as if that explained everything, as if meeting her where she was the most natural decision in the world, and Ava let out a quiet breath, something close to disbelief, but not quite, because part of her respected the fact that he did not try to pull her into his environment, did not assume she would adjust to him. Instead, he adjusted to her, and that mattered more than she expected. So, she said, crossing her arms lightly, grounding herself in a posture that kept distance without closing the door completely. What do you want to talk about? And Ethan did not answer. Immediately, his eyes studying her again in that same quiet way, as if he was measuring not just her words but the space between them, the tension, the boundaries she had drawn. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, direct. Last night was not just a moment, he said, and Ava felt something tighten in her chest, because she had been trying to convince herself that it was, trying to keep it contained, manageable. But hearing him say otherwise forced her to confront the possibility that it meant more, that it could lead somewhere she had not planned for, and she held his gaze, unwilling to let him define it without challenge. Then what was it? She asked, her tone steady. But there was an edge now, something that demanded clarity, and Ethan did not look away, did not hesitate. It was someone refusing to stay silent in a place that expects silence, he said, and the words landed deeper than she expected, because they were not about the scene, not about embarrassment or misunderstanding. They were about something she carried with her long before that night, something she had learned to suppress. And for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not have anything to say, but because she was deciding whether she wanted to let him see that part of her, whether she was willing to let this conversation move beyond surface level. And the seconds ticked by, her brakes slipping away, the reality of her world pressing back in, reminding her that she did not have time for conversations that did not lead somewhere real. And finally she spoke, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. You came all the way here to tell me that, she said, and there was a hint of skepticism there, a challenge, Because if this was going to continue, it needed to mean something, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not in a way that revealed everything, but enough to show that he understood the weight of her question. "No," he said, his tone just as steady as before. "I came here to ask you what you were going to do next." And that stopped her, completely, because it was not what she expected, not an offer, not an apology, not even a continuation of what had already happened, but a question that placed the decision entirely in her hands. And as she stood there, the city moving around them, the time slipping through her fingers, she realized that whatever this was becoming, it was not something he was controlling alone. It was something she had the power to shape, if she chose to step forward instead of away. The question did not leave her immediately. It lingered, settling somewhere deeper than the surface, because it was not just about what happened next with him. It was about what she had been doing her entire life, choosing when to speak and when to stay silent, choosing when to step forward and when to step back. And now, standing there with the city moving around them and her break ticking away second by second, Ava felt that familiar pressure of time, of responsibility, of knowing that whatever she said next had to fit into the reality she lived in, not the one he represented. And she let out a slow breath, her gaze shifting briefly past him, taking in the street, the passing people, the diner door just a few feet away, because grounding herself in those details helped her think clearly, helped her stay anchored. And when she looked back at him, her expression had changed, not softer, not warmer, just more certain. "I go back to work," she said, her tone calm, matter of fact, because that was the truth. That was always the truth. No matter what possibilities stood in front of her, her life did not pause. It did not wait for moments like this to resolve. It kept moving, demanding her attention, her effort, her time. And Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not disappointed, just acknowledging the answer as if it made perfect sense. "Of course you do," he replied. And there was something in the way he said it that felt different from how others might have. No judgment, no assumption, just understanding. And that alone made her hesitate for half a second longer than she intended, because being understood without having to explain herself was not something she experienced often. And she shifted slightly, adjusting her stance, reclaiming that small bit of control she needed to maintain. "You asked what I am going to do next," she continued, her voice steady. "That is my answer." And for a moment it seemed like that might be the end of it, a simple exchange, a clear boundary, something that could close the door before it opened too far. But Ethan did not move to leave, did not step back into the car waiting just a few feet away. Instead he remained where he was, his presence calm but intentional, as if he had not yet finished what he came to say. "That is what you have to do," he said, and Ava's brow tightened slightly, because the distinction in his words did not go unnoticed. "But that is not what I asked," he added, and there it was. Again, that shift, that subtle push that did not feel like pressure but still carried weight, because he was not asking about her schedule, not asking about her responsibilities. He was asking about her choice, about what she wanted beyond what was required of her. And that question was harder, more complicated, because it reached into a space she did not allow herself to sit in very often, a space where survival was not the only factor, where possibility existed but came with risk. And she crossed her arms a little tighter, more out of instinct than intention, creating a small barrier as she considered her response. "I do not have the luxury of thinking about what I want like that," she said finally, her voice quieter now, but still firm. Because that was the reality she knew, the one shaped by years of making decisions based on necessity, not preference. And Ethan watched her for a moment, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening in a way that made it clear he was taking her words seriously. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, not softer, but more deliberate. "That is exactly why I am asking," he said, and Ava felt that again, that slight disruption to the narrative she had built, because he was not dismissing her reality. He was acknowledging it while still challenging it. And that was unfamiliar territory, one that made her both cautious and curious at the same time. "Look," she said, exhaling lightly as she glanced back toward the diner door, the seconds slipping away faster now. "I do not know what you think this is, but I am not someone you can just—" She paused, searching for the right word, the one that captured the imbalance she felt without giving him more power than she was willing to admit. "Add to your world like a project," she finished, her gaze locking onto his again, steady, unyielding, because she needed him to understand that, needed to set that boundary clearly before anything else could be said. And for a brief moment there was silence, not tense, not uncomfortable, just still, as if both of them were measuring what came next. And then Ethan gave a small shake of his head, not dismissive, but certain. "That is not what I am doing," he said, his voice even, and Ava studied him closely, searching for any sign that this was just another version of something she had seen before, another form of control disguised as opportunity. But she did not find it, not immediately, and that made her more cautious, not less, because the absence of something she expected did not mean it was not there. It just meant she had to look harder. "Then what are you doing?" she asked, her tone sharper now, because if he was going to continue this, she needed clarity, needed something real to hold on to, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. "I am offering you a conversation where your voice does not get dismissed," he said, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard, because it was not framed as an opportunity, not as a favor, not as something she should be grateful for, just a space, a chance to be heard. And for a second she did not respond, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding whether that was enough, whether that was something worth stepping toward. And the door behind her opened briefly, the sound of the diner spilling out for a moment before closing again, a reminder that her time was up, that decisions had to be made quickly. And Ava took a step back, creating a small distance between them, not retreating, just resetting the space. "I have to go," she said, her voice steady again, grounded in the reality she could not ignore. And Ethan nodded once more, accepting it without argument, without trying to extend the moment beyond what she allowed. "Then I will not take any more of your time," he replied, and for a second it seemed like that might be it, that the conversation would end there, unfinished but not unresolved. And Ava turned slightly, ready to step back inside, ready to return to the world she understood. But just before she reached the door, his voice came again, not loud, not urgent, but enough to stop her. "Ava," and she paused, her hand resting lightly against the handle as she looked back over her shoulder. And this time, there was something different in his expression, something more direct, more intentional. "When you decide what you want, not what you have to do, let me know," he said. And the words settled in a way she could not immediately process, because they did not demand an answer, did not create pressure. They simply stayed with her, waiting. And as she stood there for a brief second longer than necessary, she realized that walking away from this would not be as simple as closing a door, because he had already given her something to carry with her, a question she could not ignore. And as she finally pushed the door open, stepping back into the noise and motion of her world, she knew one thing with certainty: this conversation was not finished, not even close. The door closed behind her with a soft chime, but the noise inside the diner did not feel the same anymore. It was louder somehow, sharper, every clatter of plates and every call of an order pulling her back into motion, while her mind stayed somewhere outside on that sidewalk, replaying his words in a loop she could not shut off. And Ava moved automatically, picking up a tray, pouring coffee, nodding at customers, her body doing what it had done 100 times before, while something deeper shifted beneath the surface, because it was not just what he said, it was how he said it, calm, certain, leaving the choice entirely with her. And that was new, unfamiliar in a way that made it hard to ignore. "You okay?" Jasmine's voice cut through as she slid into the space beside her at the counter, lowering her voice just enough to keep it between them. And Ava blinked, realizing she had been standing still for a second too long, her hand resting on the coffee pot without moving. "Yeah, I am fine," she replied quickly, too quickly, and Jasmine raised an eyebrow, not convinced but not pushing, because they both knew how this worked. You asked once, you did not pry unless invited. And Ava was grateful for that, grateful for the space to figure this out on her own, even if she was not sure what she was figuring out yet. And she turned back to her tasks, moving faster now, almost as if she could outrun the thoughts that followed her from table to table. But they stayed, persistent, threading through everything, through the way a customer snapped their fingers for attention, through the way someone barely looked up when she refilled their cup, through the way she forced a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And suddenly she was aware of it again, that familiar imbalance, the the one she had learned to navigate without thinking, the one she had accepted as part of the job, part of life, and now, after that conversation, it felt different, not invisible anymore, not something she could move through without noticing. And that made everything just a little heavier, just a little harder to ignore. And when her shift finally slowed, the rush easing into a quieter afternoon rhythm, Ava found herself at the back counter, wiping down a surface that was already clean, her mind drifting again despite her efforts. And without fully deciding to, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone, the screen lighting up in her hand. And for a moment she just stared at it, not opening any messages, not typing anything, just holding it, feeling the weight of a decision that had not been made yet, but was already shaping her thoughts. And she remembered the card on her table at home, the one she had not thrown away, the one that sat there like a question she could not answer. And now there was this, his words, his presence, the way he had stepped into her world without hesitation. And it was not about him anymore, not entirely. It was about what he represented, a possibility she had never allowed herself to consider seriously, because it came with risk, with uncertainty, with the chance of being disappointed in a way that cut deeper than the small, everyday frustrations she was used to. And Ava inhaled slowly, setting the phone down on the counter for a second, pressing her palms flat against the cool surface as she grounded herself again, because this was where she needed to be. This was what she understood, not conversations that blurred lines, not invitations that came without explanation. And yet, even as she told herself that, something inside her resisted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make her hesitate, to make her question whether staying exactly where she was had ever really been enough. Break is over. Her manager called from across the room, and Ava nodded automatically, slipping her phone back into her pocket, returning to her tasks with the same steady focus she always had. But the difference was there now, subtle but undeniable, a shift in how she saw the space she moved through, the way she carried herself within it. And as the afternoon turned into evening, the light outside dimming, the diner filling again with a new wave of customers, Ava found herself noticing things she had not paid attention to before, the tone in people's voices, the way respect was given or withheld, the small moments where she could choose to speak or stay silent. And each time, she felt that question again, not his voice exactly, but the idea of it. What are you going to do next? And it stayed with her through the rest of her shift, through the final orders, the closing routine, the wiping down of tables and stacking of chairs, until finally she stepped outside again, the night air cool against her skin, the street quieter now, and she paused for just a second before heading toward the bus stop, her hand brushing lightly against her pocket where her phone rested, because she knew, even without checking, that nothing had changed and everything had changed at the same time. And as she walked, her steps steady but her thoughts anything but, she realized something she had not fully admitted yet. This was not about whether she would respond, not anymore. It was about when and what she would say when she did, because the moment had already passed where she could pretend none of this mattered. And now, whether she liked it or not, she was already in the middle of something that was going to ask more of her than she had ever planned to give. By the time Ava reached her apartment that night, the city had quieted into something softer, the distant hum of traffic blending into a steady background that matched the rhythm of her thoughts. And she closed the door behind her with a slow exhale, leaning back against it for just a second longer than usual, because the weight of the day had not stayed at the diner. It had followed her home, settled into the small space around her, and she could feel it in the way her shoulders stayed tense. Even as she kicked off her shoes, in the way her mind refused to settle into the usual routine of letting the day go, and instead of moving straight into her normal habits, she found herself standing still, her gaze drifting toward the small table beside her bed where the card still rested, exactly where she had left it. And for a moment she just looked at it, the clean edges, the deliberate font, the name that had become impossible to ignore, Margaret Whitmore. And next to that memory came another, the message from Ethan, his voice in her mind asking a question she still had not answered, not fully. And Ava pushed herself off the door, walking slowly across the room, her steps quieter now, more intentional, as if she was approaching something that mattered more than she wanted to admit. And when she reached the table, she did not pick the card up right away. She just stood there, her fingers resting lightly against the surface, grounding herself before making a choice. Because that was what this was, not a reaction, not an accident, but a decision, and she had spent her whole life being careful with those, measuring them against consequences, weighing them against what she could afford to lose, and this felt different, not because it was bigger, but because it was uncertain in a way that did not come with clear answers, and she hated that. Hated not knowing exactly where something would lead before stepping into it. And yet, as she finally picked up the card, turning it over between her fingers, she realized that certainty had never really been part of the moments that changed her life. Those had always come unannounced, unexpected, forcing her to adapt, to respond, to grow in ways she did not plan for. And slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached for her phone, her heart not racing, not anxious, just steady in a way that felt unfamiliar, because this was not fear, it was awareness, the kind that came when you knew something mattered, and she unlocked the screen, scrolling to the message from Ethan, reading it again, and then again, until the words felt less like an interruption and more like an opening. And for a second she hovered there, her thumb still, her thoughts clear in a way they had not been all day, because she had spent hours trying to push this away, trying to fit it into a space that made sense, and now she was done with that. Now she was ready to decide, and she typed, slowly, deliberately, each word chosen with care. Tomorrow I am off after 3 in the afternoon, she wrote, her tone even, controlled, not giving more than she intended, but not holding back either. If you still want to talk, I will meet you somewhere public, and she paused. For a moment, reading it over, making sure it said exactly what she meant, that it kept her grounded, that it did not give him more control than she was willing to allow. And then she sent it, the message leaving her screen with a soft motion that felt heavier than it should have, and she set the phone down on the table beside the card, both of them now connected in a way that made this feel real, immediate, no longer something she could postpone or ignore, and she stepped back, crossing her arms lightly as she looked at them, because this was it, the moment where possibility turned into action, where a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and for a second she wondered if she had made a mistake, if this would lead to something she could not control, something that would disrupt the fragile balance she had built for herself. But that thought did not settle the way it used to. It did not pull her back or make her regret the choice. Instead, it simply existed alongside something else, something stronger, the sense that she was no longer just reacting to the world around her. She was choosing how to move through it, and that alone felt like a shift she could not ignore. And as she moved through the rest of her night, making a simple dinner, setting her clothes aside for the next day, the routine grounding her again, she noticed that the tension she had carried earlier had changed, not gone, but different, less about uncertainty and more about anticipation. And when her phone buzzed again a few minutes later, she did not hesitate this time. She picked it up immediately, her eyes scanning the screen as the reply appeared. Tomorrow at 3:30. I will send you the location. And she read it once, then again, her expression thoughtful but steady, because this was happening now, not in theory, not as a possibility, but as a reality she had chosen to step into. And as she set the phone down again, turning off the light, and settling into her bed, she stared at the ceiling for a moment longer than usual, her mind quiet in a way that felt new. Because for the first time since all of this started, she was not trying to figure out what it meant. She was simply moving forward, and as sleep slowly pulled her under, one thought stayed with her, clear and undeniable. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was walking into it on her own terms. The next day did not arrive gently. It came with a kind of clarity that Ava could not ignore, the kind that settled in her chest the moment her eyes opened, reminding her that this was not just another shift, not just another routine day she could move through without thinking. And she lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, letting that awareness settle before she moved, because rushing into it would not make it easier. It would only blur the edges of something she needed to face clearly. And when she finally sat up, her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each step carried more weight than usual, her mind already organizing the day ahead, not just in terms of hours and tasks, but in terms of what it meant, what it could become. And she moved through her morning routine with a quiet focus, brushing her hair, choosing her clothes with more care than she normally would, not because she wanted to impress, but because she wanted to feel like herself, grounded, composed, someone who walked into situations on her own terms. And when she stepped outside, the air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just sharper, as if everything was more defined, more real, and the bus ride to work passed in a blur she did not fully register, her thoughts steady but distant, centered on one point she could not avoid, 3:30, and by the time she reached the diner, the familiar routine pulled her in again. Orders, coffee, movement, but this time it felt like something she was moving through rather than something she was anchored to, as if part of her had already stepped beyond it, already looking ahead, and the hours moved faster than they usually did, each task marking time in a way she was acutely aware of, until finally the clock edged closer to 3, and Ava found herself at the back counter, wiping her hands on a towel that did not need it, her mind already shifting gears, preparing to leave, to step out of the role she had been in all day, and into something else entirely. "You heading out early?" Jasmine asked, noticing the change in her pace, and Ava nodded slightly, keeping it simple. "I have something to take care of," she replied, because explaining it still felt too complicated, too uncertain, and Jasmine gave her a small smile, the kind that said she understood more than she asked, and that was enough. And when the clock hit 3, Ava untied her apron, folding it neatly before setting it down, a small act that felt more significant than it should have, because it marked a transition, a shift from one part of her day to another, and she grabbed her bag, stepping out into the afternoon light, the sun lower now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and for a moment she just stood there, taking it in, grounding herself before moving forward, and then her phone buzzed, the sound sharp in the quiet of the moment, and she pulled it out, already knowing who it would be, and the message was simple, precise. "Corner of Lake and Wabash. There is a cafe on the east side. I will be there." And Ava read it once, her gaze lifting to the street in front of her as she pictured the location, a place she had passed before but never entered, a space that sat somewhere between worlds, not as exclusive as Whitmore House, but not entirely hers either, and that felt intentional, and she slipped her phone back into her bag, starting toward the bus stop with steady steps, her pace even, her breathing controlled, because this was happening now, not as a possibility, not as a question, but as a reality she had chosen, and the ride downtown felt shorter than usual, the city unfolding around her in familiar patterns that felt slightly different today, as if she was seeing it from a new angle, noticing details she had overlooked before, the transitions between neighborhoods, the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the way space itself could change depending on who occupied it. And when she stepped off the bus, the energy of downtown wrapped around her, busier, louder, more polished, and she walked toward the cafe, her eyes scanning the street as she approached, her posture straight, her expression calm but focused, because she needed to walk into this as herself, not as someone trying to fit into a space that was not built for her. And when she reached the corner, she paused for just a second, taking in the storefront, the glass windows reflecting the movement of the city, the people inside, some in business attire, others more casual, all of them existing in that in-between space, and she stepped inside, the soft sound of the door closing behind her marking the moment, and immediately she spotted him, seated near the window, exactly where he said he would be, his presence unmistakable even in a room like this, not because he stood out, but because he did not try to, and that made him noticeable in a different way, and Ava walked toward him, her steps measured, her focus steady, and when she reached the table, he stood, a simple gesture, but one that carried a kind of respect she registered immediately, and for a brief second, they just looked at each other, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as the moment settled between them, and Ava realized something then, something clear and undeniable. This was no longer about what happened before, this was about what they were about to build from it, and that was a choice she was making with every step she took forward. He waited until she sat down before taking his seat again, a small detail that Ava noticed immediately, not because it was unusual, but because it was intentional, and intention was something she paid attention to, especially here, especially now. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them, the soft clink of cups, the low murmur of conversations, the hiss of an espresso machine somewhere behind the counter, all of it grounding and distant at the same time, and Ava placed her bag beside her chair, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table as she met his gaze, steady, unflinching, because if this was going to be a conversation, it would be on equal ground, not one where she adjusted to fit into his world, and Ethan seemed to understand that without her having to say it, his expression calm, attentive, as if he had been expecting exactly this version of her. "You came," he said simply, and there was no surprise in his voice, no assumption, just acknowledgement, and Ava gave a small nod. "I said I would," she replied, her tone even, because following through mattered to her. It always had, and for a brief second something shifted in his expression, not enough to fully define, but enough for her to register that her words meant something more than just a response, and a server approached their table, breaking the moment gently, asking for their order, and Ava hesitated for just a second, scanning the menu, not because she did not know what she wanted, but because she was aware of the setting, the difference in price, the unspoken expectations, and she chose something simple, something she was comfortable with. And when the server turned to Ethan, he ordered just as simply, no additions, no unnecessary detail. And that, again, felt deliberate. And once they were alone again, the quiet settled back in, not uncomfortable, but charged with the weight of everything unsaid, and Ava leaned back slightly, creating just enough space to think clearly, to keep control of the moment. "You said this was not just about last night," she began, her voice steady, direct, because she was not here for vague conversations or open-ended curiosity. She needed clarity, needed something real to hold on to, and Ethan nodded, his hands resting loosely on the table, not closed off, not overly expressive, just present. "It is not," he said, and Ava held his gaze, waiting, because she was not going to fill the silence for him. "Not this time," and after a brief pause, he continued, "What you did was not about a single moment. It was a pattern," he said, and Ava's brow tightened slightly, because that word carried weight, implication, and she did not like being defined by someone who did not know her. "You do not know me," she replied, her tone firm, not defensive, just clear, and Ethan did not push back, did not argue. Instead he nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her statement. "You are right," he said, and that stopped her for a second, because she expected resistance, not agreement, and he continued, before she could respond, "But I know what I saw, and I know what it takes to do what you did in a room like that," and Ava felt that again, that subtle shift, because he was not claiming to understand her life. He was recognizing something specific, something she could not easily dismiss, and she crossed her arms lightly, considering his words carefully, because recognition without assumption was rare, and she was not sure yet what to do with it. "And what exactly do you think that means?" she asked, her tone quieter now, but no less direct, because if he was going to continue this, he needed to be clear, and Ethan did not hesitate, his gaze steady. "It means you have a voice that people notice, even when they do not want to," he said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to argue against, because it was not exaggerated, not framed as something extraordinary, just a fact he had observed, and Ava let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table as she processed that, because she had never thought of it that way, not as something people noticed, but as something that often got her into trouble, something she had learned to control, to limit, and now he was presenting it as something else, something with weight, with potential, and that idea unsettled her more than she expected. "And what does that have to do with you?" she asked, bringing the focus back to him, because she needed to understand his role in this, his intention, and Ethan leaned back slightly, not distancing himself, just shifting his posture as he considered his answer. "Because I am in rooms like that all the time," he said, "and most of the time, the people in them do not hear anything outside their own perspective." And Ava watched him closely, because this was the first time he was speaking about himself in a way that was not tied to her, and there was something in his tone that felt honest, not performative, not calculated, and he continued, "What you did disrupted that," he said, "and that matters." And Ava felt the weight of those words settle, not fully understood yet, but significant, because disruption was not something she had ever been told was valuable. It was something she had been told to avoid, to minimize, and now he was framing it differently, and for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not have anything to say, but because she was deciding whether she wanted to engage with that idea, whether she was willing to see herself through that lens. And the drinks arrived, placed carefully on the table, a small pause in the conversation that gave her a second to gather her thoughts. And when the server left, Ava reached for her cup, taking a small sip, grounding herself again before setting it down, her gaze returning to him with a new kind of focus. "You still have not answered my question," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What does that have to do with me sitting here with you?" And this time, Ethan did not pause, did not measure his words as carefully. "Because I want to understand how someone like you sees a world that people like me often ignore," he said. And there it was, clear, direct, no hidden layers, no manipulation, just a request. And Ava held his gaze, searching for anything beneath it, any sign that this was something else, something she should be cautious of, and she did not find it, not immediately, and that did not make her trust him, not yet, but it did make her consider something she had not before, that this might not be about him offering her something, but about him asking something from her. And that shifted the dynamic in a way she could not ignore, because it meant she had leverage, she had control, she had the ability to decide how much of herself she was willing to give. And as she sat there, the city moving outside the window, the cafe buzzing quietly around them, Ava realized that this was no longer just a conversation she had walked into. It was one she was actively shaping, and that realization changed everything. The shift in the conversation did not come with a dramatic moment. It came quietly, settling between them as Ava leaned forward slightly, her fingers wrapping around the warm cup in front of her, as if grounding herself in something tangible before stepping into something less certain. And for the first time since she sat down, her gaze softened just enough to allow space for something beyond defense, not trust, not yet, but consideration, and that alone changed the air between them, because Ethan noticed it immediately, the way her posture shifted from guarded to intentional, the way she was no longer just responding, but choosing how to engage, and he did not interrupt it, did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, he let it exist, let her take the lead in a conversation that had started because of her voice in the first place. And Ava took a slow breath, her eyes briefly dropping to the table before returning to his, steady again, but now with a different kind of focus. "You want to understand," she said, her tone measured, not questioning, not agreeing, just acknowledging what he had asked. And Ethan nodded once, simple, direct, and Ava tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that mirrored how he had been studying her since the beginning, weighing not just his words but the consistency behind them, the way he held himself, the way he listened without interrupting, without trying to control the direction of the conversation. And that mattered more than she expected, because it gave her space to decide how much she was willing to give. And for a moment she said nothing, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to make it clear that what she said next was not automatic, not rehearsed, but chosen. "Then you need to. Here's something you might not like," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, and there was no hesitation in it now, no uncertainty, because if this was going to continue, it would be honest, not filtered, not softened to make it easier for him to accept. And Ethan's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, a subtle shift that told her he understood the weight of what she was about to say. And she continued, her words steady, deliberate. "People like you do not notice what is missing, because your world was built without it," she said, and the statement hung in the air for a second, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, the kind of truth that did not need to be raised to be felt. And Ethan did not interrupt, did not defend. He simply listened, and Ava saw that, registered it, and it pushed her forward. "You walk into rooms where everything already fits you, where the conversations are designed around what you understand, what you expect," she added, her gaze steady, "and you do not have to think about the people who are not there, or the ones who are there but not really heard." And for a moment she paused, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted him to sit with that, to actually hear it, instead of just waiting for his turn to respond. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something deeper, not anger, but experience. "I do," she said simply, and those two words held more than anything else she had said so far, because they were not about him. They were about her, about the reality she moved through every day, the awareness she carried whether she wanted to or not, and for a second the space between them shifted again, not in tension, but in depth, because this was no longer just an exchange of ideas. It was something more personal, something that required him to do more than just listen. It required him to understand, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table as he absorbed her words, not rushing to respond, not deflecting, just present. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "I know that," he said. And Ava's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in disbelief, but in careful evaluation, because those words could mean a lot of things, and she needed to know what they meant from him. And he continued before she could question it. "I know that my world does not include everything it should," he said, "but knowing that is not the same as understanding it." And Ava felt that shift again, that subtle difference in how he approached the conversation, because he was not claiming awareness as an excuse, he was acknowledging its limitation, and that mattered, more than she expected it to. And for a moment, she did not respond, not because she did not have anything to say, but because she was reassessing, recalibrating her understanding of him. And that was not something she did easily, not something she offered without reason. And the cafe continued around them, the soft hum of life moving forward. But at their table, something had changed, something that could not be undone. Because now the conversation was not just about what he wanted to understand, it was about what she was willing to show him. And that was a choice she controlled entirely. And Ava leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing just enough to signal that she was not pulling away, not shutting down, but also not giving everything at once. "Understanding is not something you ask for once," she said, her tone steady, thoughtful now. "It is something you have to keep showing up for." And Ethan met her gaze, holding it without hesitation. "Then I will," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that did not try to convince her, did not push her to believe him. It simply existed, and Ava studied him for a moment longer, searching for anything that contradicted that, anything that suggested this was temporary, performative, but she did not find it, not yet, and that did not mean she trusted him, not completely, but it meant she did not dismiss him either, and that alone was a shift she could not ignore. And as she reached for her cup again, taking a small sip, her mind clear in a way it had not been before, she realized something she had not expected when she walked into this cafe. This was not just about him understanding her world. It was about her deciding how much of that world she was willing to let him see. And for the first time since all of this started, that decision felt entirely hers to make. The moment did not end with a clear conclusion. It unfolded quietly, like something that would continue long after they both stood up from that table. And Ava felt it as she sat there, the warmth of the coffee fading in her hands while something else took its place, something steadier, something that felt less like uncertainty and more like direction, not because everything had been answered, but because she understood her role in what came next, and that changed the weight of the situation entirely. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the conversation settling into a silence that did not need to be filled, because it was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said and everything that had not. And Ava leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but intentional, her eyes still on Ethan as she considered what this had become, what it could become, and more importantly, what she was willing to allow it to become. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because for the first time since all of this started, she was not reacting to him. She was choosing how to engage with him. And that shift gave her something she had not expected, a sense of control that did not depend on his world, his influence, or his expectations. And she let out a small breath, not tired, not overwhelmed, just aware, and she reached for her bag, her movements unhurried, deliberate, signaling something without having to say it out loud. And Ethan noticed immediately, his attention sharpening slightly, not because he was trying to stop her, but because he understood that this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would set the tone for everything that followed. And Ava stood, her chair sliding back softly against the floor, and for a brief second she looked down at him, not from a place of distance, but from a place of clarity. "This does not change overnight," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of everything she had shared, everything she had chosen to reveal. And Ethan nodded, not interrupting, not trying to rush her, just listening. because that was what he had committed to. And Ava continued, her gaze unwavering. Understanding is not just about hearing me today. It is about what you do tomorrow and the day after that. And there was no accusation in her tone, no demand, just a truth she was not willing to compromise on. And Ethan met her gaze fully, standing now as well, matching her presence without overpowering it. Then I will keep showing up, he said. And there it was again, that same quiet certainty, not loud, not persuasive, just consistent. And Ava studied him for a second longer, searching for anything that contradicted that, anything that suggested this would fade once it became inconvenient. And she did not find it, not in this moment. And that did not mean she believed him completely, but it meant she was willing to see what he would do next, and that was more than she had expected to offer when she walked in. And she gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement, and she turned slightly, reaching into her bag, pulling out a folded receipt from earlier, a small, ordinary piece of paper that contrasted sharply with everything else in this moment. And she placed it on the table between them, sliding it lightly toward him. Start by paying attention to the small things, she said, her tone thoughtful now, almost reflective. The way people are treated when no one important is watching, the way voices get ignored before they ever get heard. And Ethan glanced down at the receipt, not because it held any real value, but because of what it represented, something simple, something easily overlooked, something that carried meaning beyond its appearance. And when he looked back up, Ava was already stepping away, not abruptly, not hesitantly, just moving forward with the same steady confidence she had carried into the conversation. And for a brief second, he watched her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something deeper, something that understood the significance of what had just happened. And Ava reached the door, her hand resting on the handle as she paused for just a moment, not to look back immediately, but to take in the feeling of it, the shift that had taken place, the line she had drawn and the space she had opened at the same time. And then she glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze one last time, her expression calm, grounded, and unmistakably certain. If you are serious, you will not need to ask me what comes next, she said. And the words landed with a quiet finality that did not close the door, but did not leave it open without condition either. And then she stepped outside, the city air meeting her again, the movement of people and traffic pulling her back into a world she understood, but this time it felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. And as she walked down the sidewalk, her steps steady, her mind clear, she did not look back again, not because she was closing herself off, but because she knew that whatever happened next would not come from looking over her shoulder, it would come from moving forward. And behind her, inside that cafe, Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, the receipt still on the table, the weight of her words settling in, not as something to respond to, but as something to act on. And for the first time in a long time, he understood that this was not about winning someone over. It was about becoming someone worth standing beside. And that realization, quiet and undeniable, marked the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully see, but both of them had already chosen to step into.